Hi, seniors. Okay, so in this last week that we're looking at the life and times and events, experiences, and people that shaped Malcolm X's life, we're looking at his last movement, which was this creation of the Organization of African American Unity and his plans on taking the treatment of Black Americans in the United States to the United Nations. Essentially, instead of talking about civil rights, which talks about the problem within the boundaries of the United States, he's talking about moving this issue to a human rights, which would then be held accountable by the United Nations. So what we're looking at is how this summer, with the case of the murder of George Floyd, that similarly they looked to bring this issue out of the domestic means like within the United States, to a world issue. So this comes from Time magazine, and the title of the article is "A Plan to Take the George Floyd Case to the UN Highlights a Decades-Old Tension Between Civil Rights and Human Rights." Let's take a look. We know that they only met one time, these two leaders, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Hi, Khadijah. Sorry, quick visitor. We know that these two leaders, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, only met one time in Washington, D.C. during the Voting Rights Act of 1964. Who knows what that partnership could have brought. Okay, so this article from Time magazine was this past summer, June 18th, 2020. As people across the globe take to the streets to demand justice in the wake of George Floyd's killing, the case against the four now former Minneapolis police officers involved in his death has already begun. Derek Chauvin, the white officer who pressed his knee to Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes, has been charged with second-degree murder, and the 3 other officers present with aiding and abetting. But lawyers representing the Floyd family, S.L. Merritt and Benjamin Crump, aren't looking only to the U.S. criminal justice system. They have announced that they also plan to take the matter to the United Nations Human Rights Council. Merritt and Crump also represent the families of 2 other African Americans whose deaths have shocked the public in recent weeks, Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and have in the past worked on other high-profile homicide cases involving police brutality, such as Eric Garner and Michael Brown. All of those names are people, African Americans, who were killed by police officers in the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years. And this isn't the first time their clients have gone to the UN. In 2014, Michael Brown's parents gave heart-wrenching testimony before the United Nations Committee Against Torture in Geneva. That same year, the Office of the Commissioner on Human Rights announced that Garner and Brown cases have added to our existing concerns over the long-standing prevalence of racial discrimination faced by African Americans, particularly in relation to access to justice and discriminatory police practices. As Merritt and Crump approach the UN, the involvement of the international community draws attention to a tension that has existed for more than half a century within the movement for African American rights. For much of the history of the Black freedom struggle in the United States, civic leaders and politicians used the term civil rights to characterize the objective of the movement to gain equal rights in this country. The period to which the current movement has been compared is known as the Civil Rights Movement. but not everyone at that time thought that civil rights were the goal. Malcolm X, who abandoned the philosophy of Black nationalism in favor of more inclusive internationalism, a philosophy that aimed to encourage allyship with oppressed people globally, admonished Black Americans in the mid-1960s to abandon the domestic agenda for civil rights in favor of an international agenda for human rights. In fact, this effort has been called the unfinished work of Malcolm X, which came to a tragic halt when he was assassinated on February 21st, 1965. The problem with civil rights, Malcolm argued, was that such a framing defined the matter as a domestic issue, focused on guaranteeing African Americans equal access to the rights of U.S. citizens. In his view, that limited the potential of the movement and left Black people at the mercy of a government that had ignored its pleas for equality since the post-civil rights era. Okay, so you're going to want to return to this paragraph to answer the questions in this week's building background. Talking about why did he, Malcolm X, want to reframe a new way to look and observe the problem, like a picture frame, and instead of looking at the issue in the terms of civil rights, he wanted to look at this as a problem of human rights. Malcolm X was no stranger to police brutality. In Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, Manning Marable recalls a notorious incident involving Los Angeles police and the Nation of Islam in 1962, which reads like a story ripped from today's headlines. This is the one we've read about in the past, where he was holding up a picture of a man who had been killed by police. On April 27, 1962, while members of the nation were delivering clothes from the dry cleaner to the mosque, two white police officers who were on a stakeout approached the men, believing the clothes were stolen. The details are murky on what followed. After some pushing and shoving and a call for backup, which brought at least 70 additional officers to the scene, the mosque was raided. What is clear is that 15 minutes later, when the dust was settled, 7 Muslims were shot. Marable explains. They included Ronald Stokes, we've heard that name before, a Korean war vet who was fatally shot from behind while trying to surrender. Less than a month later, Malcolm X delivered a blistering speech against the LA City officials for their willingness to tolerate police brutality. By 1964, Malcolm X had split with his spiritual mentor Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam to launch what he called the Organization of African American Unity, which, with a rallying cry for Black people to set their differences aside for the common goal of Black liberation. In his classic speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, delivered twice on April 3rd and 12th, 1964, less than a year before he was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, he channeled the sentiments of Revolutionary War patriot and slave owner Patrick Henry, who in 1775 ironically cried, "Give me liberty or give me death." Okay, so you're going to be asked to explain why is that ironic that Patrick Henry, a Revolutionary War patriot and slave owner, is known for his cry of "Give me liberty or give me death." Malcolm echoed these sentiments nearly 200 years later when he stated in the second iteration of the speech, "It's the ballot or the bullet. It's liberty or it's death. It's freedom for everybody or freedom for nobody." At the conclusion of this speech, Malcolm admonished Black Americans to approach their freedom struggle from an international viewpoint, which would reframe the struggle as one not for civil rights, but human rights, for which they would be entitled to seek the aid of the international community, the world community. When you expand the civil rights struggle to the level of human rights, he stated on April 3rd, you can take the case of the Black man in this country before the nations in the UN. He also explained how he saw the difference between civil rights and human rights. Okay, so this might help you with your answer as well. You can take Uncle Sam, that's the US, you can take Uncle Sam before a world court, but the only level you can do it on is the level of human rights. Civil rights keeps you under his restriction, under his jurisdiction, meaning under the United States jurisdiction, meaning under the United States judicial or legal system. Civil rights keeps you in his pocket. Civil rights means you're asking Uncle Sam to treat you right. Human rights are something you were born with. Human rights are your God-given rights. Human rights are the rights that are recognized by all nations on this earth. Anytime anyone violates your human rights, you can take them to the World Court. His focus on human rights, however, didn't mean he had given up on the possibility of winning civil equality within the United States. In fact, Malcolm believed that while revolutions have historically been bloody, the US was uniquely positioned for a revolution devoid of bloodshed, without bloodshed, which goes against the image that the news wanted to paint him as violent, but he believed that this revolution could be done non-violently. Today, he stated, this country can become involved in a revolution that won't take bloodshed. All she's got to do is give the Black man in this country everything that's due to him. Everything. Malcolm X, whose political philosophy of freedom was underscored by the mantra, by any means necessary, called for a revolution that would overthrow the system of white supremacy rather than integrate Blacks into it. Even so, like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm believed that such a revolution could be achieved through nonviolent means. While he believed Black people had a right to defend themselves if attacked, he counseled white America to listen to King rather than face the alternative. Okay, so we're going to unpack that statement in your questions for building background. What do you think that means? What does that mean to you? That the revolution is to overthrow the system of white supremacy rather than integrate Blacks into it. Careful reading. Just the months before this speech, Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had met for the first and only time. The two men were on Capitol Hill to attend a Senate hearing on school segregation and employment discrimination. Malcolm, who had attempted on several occasions to reach out to King and had conversed extensively with King's wife, Coretta, approached the Southern minister with his hand outstretched. While cameras flashed as the two men greeted each other, Malcolm expressed his desire to be more involved with King's movement. I am throwing myself into the heart of the civil rights struggle, he told King. He clarified his intent further in his speech the following month. We have injected ourselves into the civil rights struggle, he said, and we intend to expand it from the level of civil rights to the level of human rights. Today, as Black America is still pressed under the weight of white supremacy and violence, including extrajudicial killings, that struggle continues, with a new generation embracing Malcolm X's idea that human rights is the path to Black liberation. The work of expanding the struggle continues too. Thank you, guys.